Thanks to Puppetswar for sponsoring this video. Now, over the years, I've heard that yellow is one of the worst or hardest colours to paint, yielding different and varied results, whether that be too beige, too dull, too green, or even too yellow. So, myself and Pat have been trawling across the internet to find a variety of different ways of painting yellow, and we've yielded some interesting results. You may, at the end of this video, have a new firm favourite. I certainly do. Now, the models we're going to be using in this video are going to be the Bushy Prime Gunners that are from Puppetswar, so if you want to check them out and see how to get hold of them, there's a link in the description that will take you straight there as well. So our first way of painting yellow is probably going to be the most simplest and straightforward way of painting yellow, which is to get a rattle can and spray the model yellow. Simple. If the majority of your model is going to be yellow, honestly, I think it's the best starting point. It's super quick. Most of the time there is a relevant base coat to accompany the primer, but do be mindful when spraying. I'd recommend doing a couple of short burst coats instead of trying to do a full coat in one spraying. It will just clog up the detail. So there we are, that was super quick and easy, very straightforward. Now there are other yellow sprays out there available. AK have some as well as Army Painter as well. We just chose this one because it matches perfectly to Avalanche Sunset. Now, we have decided across this video to put a ranking system for all the yellows. Honestly, it varies on the model you're painting, the tone of colour you want, and the details that they have on it. But we're doing a ranking system anyway, and it's called the Yellometer. And this particular method, we're ranking 4.8 bananas out of 5 on the Yellometer. Now, if you don't have an undercoat spray and you only have like black at home, there is another way of doing this, and this is by hand. Now, we've probably all done this at some point in our life. I used to do it a lot. As a young lad, I used to think the brightest yellow possible over black would look great. It didn't, it looked green, and well, learn from my mistakes. So what I'd say here is find a decent base coat, such as Avalanche Sunset and a couple of thin coats. So in this instance, I'll recommend a few thin coats of Avalanche Sunset. Honestly, I'm so used to using this paint, I have zero fears when base coating over black or dark tones. It's easy and cost effective, but very time consuming, and opens to a lot of errors such as thick coverage, so do take your time. But it's great if you have no primers or airbrushes. As you can see, it looks okay. It did take a lot longer than spraying it just yellow, but the results are fine. Again, just be mindful how many coats you do. And as you can see, side by side, the results look very similar. It's just doing it by hand takes a lot longer. And obviously you just be mindful of those thin coats. Now, bearing all that in mind, on the award system for the Yellometer, I'm going to award this 7 out of 12 lemons. If you're looking for a more grim dark approach, and this one we're going to show you has almost like built-in shading as well, and this is dry brushing Avalanche Sunset over a black undercoat. Now, it's ideally suited for things like smaller sections and heavily textured stuff, such as gun casing helmets, maybe like, I don't know, fur and stuff. But the models we're using in this video have a lot of texture, so I think it'll work quite well with those as well. So what we're going to do here is just heavily dry brush over that texture. I'm not removing as much as I normally would when I'm dry brushing. As you can see, these models lend themselves to this method really well. Whereas maybe a Primaris Marine, because it's got more smooth rounded armour, it probably won't be as effective. Like I said, it's very rudimentary, but very quick and has built-in shading. As you can see here, that's the completed version. So it's got some nice shading there and a decent coverage of base coats as well. I'd probably say this is more suited to structures like buildings as well as vehicles, but it depends what you're trying to achieve really. That being said, I'm going to award this 10 egg yolks out of a baker's dozen. Just before we get onto the contrast paints, I'm just going to have a quick word about our sponsor, Puppetswar. You might have heard of Puppetswar already, and if you haven't, you should. Puppetswar create 3D models you can download and print yourself, or buy resin minis individually if you don't have a printer. You can use these minis in their own tabletop gaming system or proxy them into your own armors for other games. Puppetswar has a Patreon releasing new miniatures every month. If you subscribe, you get access to a discounted back catalogue too. In their January release, you can find awesome heavy gunners, menacing orcs and vehicles, and some gruesome warrior bugs. Some of the best bits about the design of these miniatures is they're built for magnets. Want to change your standard backpack for a Sashimono? Puppetswar's got you covered. Want to change your Sashimono for a rotor pack? Puppetswar has got you covered. A simple set of Marines can now serve a multitude of purposes. We also add a load of different gun options too, so you can continue to customise your minis. Now you can find all the links for Puppetswar down in the description, and would also like to thank Puppetswar for sponsoring this video. Right, contrast paint. Now another option, if the majority colour of your model is going to be yellow, is to use a contrast paint. Now this is ideally suited over a white undercoat, so if you don't have a yellow spray, get some white and then apply this contrast. Now, This contrast is one of the newer ones, which is Imperial Fist, and I would state this is the best contrast yellow out there. It's true. It's amazing. The great thing here is if you start bright, you only need to use shades and contrast to add depth, and maybe a little highlight here and there at the end. Personally, I prefer this method as it's quick and looks amazing with very little effort, and that's before any shades or highlights are applied. Now this method was really quick, and as you can see next to like the Otherland Sunset, whether that's a spray or over black, it makes it look ochre, almost brown. It's so bright, it's so vibrant, so if you want a real nice punch to yellow, this is definitely the route to go for. Again, when you're applying contrast, be mindful because it can pull into the recesses, so just soak that up. And I think on the yellometer, we shall award this 5 out of 6 corner of the cobs. So this next example is using an airbrush. We're using the exact same colours, so white undercoat with a nice bit of Imperial Fist being blasted through the airbrush, and you don't need to thin that down, it just goes straight to the airbrush as is. Now the downside to this is you will lose the contrast effect when blasting it through an airbrush, so you won't get all that extra depth in the recesses, but depending on how you want to approach this, that could potentially be a bonus as well. So this really just depends on how you want your yellow to look. So you can see side by side we have both the one done by hand and the one done by the airbrush. Now you do lose some of that definition like I said in the recesses, but this is just really nice and a really good way of getting a bright yellow that you can then add your own shades later on. And we shall award this 89 lemons out of a tree. So this next method I got from Brent from Goobertown Hobbies and Casey from eBay Miniature Rescue. Now they use things like inks and airbrushes, so we're going to go for a very rudimentary approach, which is using rattle cans or primers, some dry brushing, and in one instance we used 2 primers, a bit of pink and a bit of white. So a lot easier, a lot more accessible, but should yield very similar results. We're going to show 2 versions from a pink undercoat. Here we're using Army Painter Pixie Pink. Our first example we shall dust over with white scar. So you want to do this a little bit from the top so you still get some of that pink in the recesses. At this point I know it looks weird, however what we're now going to do is get some Imperial Fist and thin that down 50-50 with water or contrast medium, whichever you have. And what that's going to do is turn those pinks into a rich orange, and those whites will just be a nice, clean, crisp yellow. Alternatively, you could heavily dry brush white over the top if you don't have access to an airbrush or spray paint. It will leave a rougher texture, but if built up in smooth coats, you should yield similar results. Now, Brent used yellow ink from Dale & Rowley in this vid, but again, I'm going to be using some contrast, which is Imperial Fist, and on this one, I'm going to use it straight from the pot. So all in all, that was pretty quick and pretty effective. And we were so impressed by this method that we actually didn't rate it. And really, it's a stupid rating system that makes no sense anyway, so I don't care. I'm gonna eat another sweet. Stressing out again, I can't open it, I can't open it. Why is the wrapper different? What's going on? Now, our next method is using a yellow layer paint over a black undercoat. Now, in my many years of service in the studio, I heard this is the best way to paint yellows on models, and that is with an airbrush over a black undercoat. I raised eyebrows many times when I heard this and truly didn't believe it, but today we're going to give it a go. Actually, I'm lying, I'm not going to give it a go because I don't want to, and Pat's going to do it instead with an airbrush. If I don't want to do it, because it's stupid. Using Phalanx Yellow, he's applying this over a black undercoat. Good luck, Pat. It's going to take you an hour. And it's so lime green on the first coat. And it's still a bit green on the second. Skip to the end, and 7 coats later, we kind of got a yellow, although it still looks a tad green. Now, honestly, looking at it, it's not awful. I mean, because of the amount of layers that Pat's put on there, and this could be down to his inability to use an airbrush because he's new, or just because of the type of yellow it is, I don't know, but it has obscured some of the detail. And for that alone, we're going to give it 5 limes in the bin. For our next example, we were inspired by Richard Gray's stippling method. Now, a quick disclaimer, you may not notice, but I am not Richard Gray. And for a better example of this method, go check his video out. Firstly, we're stippling on thinned down Mornfang Brown, 3 parts water to 1 part paint. Now you want to do a couple of coats of this, so probably 3 coats will be enough. Then using the same mix ratio, we should do a similar effect with Zamissi Desert. Again, build up that texture and tone. And again, you probably want to do this, again, another 2 or 3 times. Now we're going to use Aerial Yellow. Again, I'm using the same mix here, but on reflection, I should have thinned this down more, but I've made my choice and now I must live with it. And what I mean by that is the way Richard did it, it was a little bit less bright and very yellowy at the moment. There was a bit more transition, a little bit more brown in there. So I've pretty much removed a lot of that brown. Now, like with Richard's video here, I'm going to drench it in a dark tone contrast. And for this, we're going to be using Darko Flesh. And whilst it's wet and working very quickly, we're applying contrast medium here. This will assist in removing some of that dark tone and basically thinning the overall effect. I wasn't sure why this was done on the model, as I'd personally thin it down before applying it. But on reflection, I do like the effect, and I imagine Richard is mimicking an oil application effect here. Lastly, I'm glazing some Aerial Yellow on the raised parts for some more definition. So I actually quite like the effect of this. Now, from my experience, a lot of those initial steps felt like they were lost a bit and they didn't really have an end effect, but I trust Richard Gray's process because he knows what he's doing. And although it was quite long-winded, I still really like the end effect. So that being said, I'm going to award this 7 Richards out of 10 Grays. So as you can see, we've got a whole range of different ways of painting yellows. Some of those have already kind of been highlighted or shaded, but what we're going to do now is for some others, we're going to show a different way of applying some shades, whether that's recessed shades, all over shades, and some different ways of highlighting with different tones. So first up, we're going to concentrate on some shading. Now there's 2 real decent methods of shading. There's all over and recessed shading. They both have their pluses and minuses. So we're going to start first of all with an all over shade. From years of painting, it's become quite apparent that though an all over shade feels quicker at the start, there is much more work in getting that brightness and punch back because you have to do a lot of layering up. Now I'm going to be applying this all over an Avalanche Sunset base coated miniature. It's quite messy, but it is very quick. And what I'm going to have to do is once that's dried, is actually go back, get Avalanche Sunset and tidy back those raised areas, and that will take ages. Now another thing though is with the new formulated Citadel shades, they're not as bad. Even better if you thin them down. So actually you could save yourself a lot of tidying up by using the new shades. So depending on which kind of shade you have, whether it's an old Citadel shade or different companies' worth of shades or the new formulated Citadel ones, you will yield different results. Like I said, from my experience, it takes a little bit longer doing the tidy up stage at the end. And for that, I'm going to award this 3 tangerines out of 1 orange. Next up is to do some recess shading. This will seem like it takes longer at the start, but I think because it's a bit neater and there's only a little bit of tidying up, it's actually probably quicker than the first version. Neatly or even roughly, recess shading may seem longer to begin with. It's actually the most efficient and quickest method to get in depth in those recesses. I'm applying this over the airbrushed Imperial Fist Mini, and as you can see, there's much less tidying up to do. What I am doing here though is that the tidying up I do need to do, I'm just going to use Aerial Yellow as it's a nice perfect match. And I would say that was a little bit quicker than actually doing it the other way, which was the all over shade. And for that reason, I am going to award this 1 Yellow Submarine out of Thunderbird 2. Now that we're focused on shading, recess shading all over, regardless, we're now going to concentrate on highlighting. Now, when it comes to yellows, there's a couple of options to pick from. Do you pick a cream or bone highlight? Do you go for a yellow highlight? Or do you dry brush it? Or do you edge highlight it? So, we're going to go through all those examples, and I guess you can decide which one works for you. Now, our first method of highlighting is using yellow highlights. So here we're using Dawn Yellow, and first up I'm going to dry brush this on the back of the model so you can see the effect of dry brushing over those rich yellows we've got. And Dawn Yellow is quite a nice yellow, so it adds a bit of pop to those edges. Now the other option, if you don't want to dry brush and you want to edge highlight, is just get your brush to a nice point and just run across those edges. Use the edgy brush if you can for some of those edges, but you will need to use a point from time to time. And again, thin it down a little bit as well. And here you can see both the effects of edge highlighting versus dry brushing, and really pick whichever one suits you. So another reason for using bone as opposed to yellow is it gives it more of a natural result as opposed to quite a stark, bright result. So sometimes, depending on the tone of yellow you use, will require maybe a yellow highlight or a bone highlight. Again, that does reflect on the base colour and the shades as well. So Imperial Fists work better, I find, with bone highlights, whereas maybe like Bad Moons probably work better with a yellow highlight. Now, another thing we're going to do now is show you what it looks like if you use a weird yellow highlight on something that's a bit more dirty. So what we're going to do is get an Avalanche Sunset base coat miniature, the one that we dry brushed over black, and we're going to use a really bright, vibrant yellow as a highlight and show the effect of that. Now, first up, we're going to dry brush this. I'm going to do this on the back like we did with the previous ones. And all in all, it doesn't look that bad. So I'm actually quite pleased with the end result, and this will work quite well again for like structures or vehicles and stuff. However, doing an edge highlight, as you can see here, isn't as good. It looks a bit weird, a little bit jarring, and I would probably describe this as a pile of sick. There we are. We have a whole load of different ways to paint yellow. Personally, I have my new favourite, which is using a pink undercoat with white over the top. I was very dubious when I saw Brent and Katie do this, but I trusted the system, trusted their ability, and it's paid off and I really like it. I'll probably still use other yellows from time to time, but hey. Thank you for watching. Thank you to our patrons. Thank you to Puppetswar. Again, I hope you've learned something from this video. Check out the links in the description. We'll see you around. Bye. Using phalanx green, he's applying this over a black undercoat. Good luck, Pat.
Are you saying phalanx green on purpose?
Phalanx.
No, green. You're saying
Yellow, idiot. And you're well, in my head.